Hey, it's Perspective. It's 2021 now. I've been a bit quiet recently. Goldfat release happened and then everything just kind of stopped. I ran out of music, I ran out of inspiration, but it's a new year. So I thought I'll jump back into it with a video that I mentioned I was going to make in one of my other videos about my production template. If you've seen those videos already, you'll notice that the project template has changed quite a bit. I found that having too many things already available, i.e. having reverb sends, delay sends, it felt like it was boxing me in a little too much. So I've made a new template and stripped it back just to sort of facilitate some more creative ideas and creative thinking that isn't as boxed in as the old template was. Quite a lot of it is the same, especially with the drums, because I like the way my drums sound. They're not always balanced correctly. I mean, I can't really listen to Stargazing anymore because I don't know what I was thinking with that drum balance. But we all grow. Every track, is technically old. It's just like buying a car. The second you buy it, it's old. But yeah, so let's just get into the template overview now. The template file will be available on my Patreon for my patrons or Patreons. I'm still not too sure what you would call them. All the people that want to support you on a monthly basis. I really appreciate that. Let's get into the video and I'll try to explain as best as I can without making this sort of like an hour or a 2-hour long affair. Trying to keep it simple and concise. So let's get into the drum breakdown first. They're all pretty much the same in terms of what's going on in the channel strip. We've got a gain plugin, a utility gain plugin. That's for gain staging if I feel like, using some analog modeled plugins such as the Waves 1176 or the LA2A, just to make sure I'm hitting that sweet spot. But to be honest, I have all of these funky and really cool boutique plugins, emulations, but the stock Logic 1176 emulation, the FET, the Studio FET compressor, is really good. And despite me owning all of these other plugins which I spent some money on, I always tend to come back to this one for some reason. I'm not quite sure why. Maybe it's because it has a built-in clipping circuit, which is super useful and is a bit of a secret weapon in the loudness war, especially when it comes to drum and bass and electronic music. If you're not clipping your shit, you're not going to get loud. And it's quite as simple as that, really. There's no magic secret. Just flick that, push the gain up, balance the output, and you'll be headlining in no time. Anyway, let's move away from that discussion. So I've got my break channel, kick, snare, rim shot, clap, hi-hat, ride, top loop, perk loop, blah, blah, blah. You get the idea. All of these blue tracks, they are routed to here, the drum group. Now, that drum group then sends all of that information to a reverb send. So that would be my drum room reverb. That's what the RVerb stands for. That gives me sort of like the ultimate mix control. Not much happening there. It's just Valhalla room with some pretty basic drum room sounds, because you don't want anything that's sort of like super heavy on the decay. You don't want too much high end getting in there, especially if you're layering breaks, because it gets really cluttered and really harsh and really top end heavy really quickly if you're not careful. You don't want too much of a pre-delay, because that would just mess up with the transients, potentially with the phase as well. You could end up introducing some phase issues if it's too sort of like pushed out. The depth, you don't really want too much of a deep space. You want it to be quite tight and controlled, just to emulate sort of like a drum room, like overheads in a drum room, for example. That's pretty much it. You can change the reverb types. So if you've got some sort of like more analog, classic breaky kind of sounds, maybe a bright room could work quite well, just to add a little bit of a top end kind of sheen to it. But anyway, is this a template video or is this a how to make a drum room reverb video? Let's move on. So looking at my drum tracks here, all of the blue tracks, you'll notice that there's also a send on each of them, which goes out to a drum parallel compression channel. Now this I use quite a lot. From the discussions that I've had in Discord, not a lot of people always go for parallel drum compression, but I really like it. It adds a lot of sort of like meat and weight and energy to it. Now that parallel channel is being sent into the drum group. I've got an 1176, this is the Waves plugin. I typically change it anyway. It might be on the channel, but I would probably end up changing it to this, or sometimes, like in my other video, I like to use the SSL-G compressor. That works pretty well. Coming back to here, you'll notice on my snare, rim shot and clap channels, there's another send. Now this goes out to another reverb effects send. That's just using the stock chroma verb, which some people say sounds really plasticky and really synthetic, but for a simple snare tail, you know, just to give it a bit of space, just to give it a little bit of character, it's okay. You've got some EQ happening after that, just to make sure there isn't too much double frequencies overlapping each other and all kinds of weird stuff. Say you've got a snare that's fundamental is hitting at about 300 hertz. Ideally on a reverb effects end, you want to cut that out. Otherwise it would just get super muddy and washed out and you lose a lot of transient punch. So that's the drums. On the main drum bus, the main drum group, I have the channel EQ, just to give the low end a bit of attention if it needs to be. I usually use this more as a visual reference more than a processing point, if that makes sense, because I like to do that either within Decapitator, which is my saturation unit of choice, especially for drums, with that Drum Fattener 1 preset, because it's all about that preset. If need be, I can drop the EQ after that, just to tidy up that low end. Even if you were to use a low cut filter that's built in to Decapitator, it still kind of has a bit of a low end rumble, and you can see that on an EQ. And then after that, after the EQ, I've got the SSL-G comp just to glue everything in, just a teeny tiny bit. Nothing too extreme, maybe sort of 1 to 2 dBs of gain reduction. That's really about it. You don't want to be squashing the hell out of anything with this, because you lose a lot of life and everything just becomes sort of like a flat and saggy mess. And you listen to drum and bass, you know that genre, our genre, is not like that at all. It's about loud sounds, really in your face, really pushed. And the key there is to clip it or to saturate it. So after the compression, after we've got a couple of dB of gain reduction there, we want to go into the saturator. Now really is my go-to. I don't think my drums would sound anything as good as they do if it wasn't for this little plugin. I'm sure there are other plugins that you could use to achieve the same sort of result, because this is pretty expensive if you don't pick it up on one of the Soundtoys sales. You know, maybe Isotope Trash 2, maybe that could be a choice. Maybe some guitar pedals. Logic's got quite a good pedal board and amp designer built into it. There's some really good effects in there. But for me, I bought Decapitator. I love Decapitator. And yeah, I'm not going too specific on how to use any of these. If you would like something a little more deep and maybe a little more focused, let me know in the comments and I can make a video on that explaining why we would do things or how you would use things or stuff like that. You know, just a bit of a recap. We've got a gain just to facilitate any analog modeled plugins that may need some gain staging. After that, we've got a channel EQ. After that, we've got a transient shaper, just to shape some of those sounds if need be. When working with breaks, you might want to pull the sustain down just to get rid of some of that room reverb, just to tighten them up a little bit. Another tip for breaks, you can use a noise gate as well to get them super punchy and super tight, but I don't really use that all too much. After the transient shaper, I've got a compressor, which is the Studio FET or compressor emulation. It's supposed to be similar to an 1176, which is really good on drums because it's super punchy, it's super fast, it just works really well. I'm not going to get into compressor settings or anything like that. That's really for another video. If you want to see that, let me know in the comments, just message me if you want. After the compressor, we have another gain utility plugin. I use these either to automate the gain here, so I'm not losing fader control. That is very important. There's nothing more annoying than automating the channel faders and then wanting to adjust the volume because you thought the mix was good. You listen to it somewhere else, it's not as good as you thought it was, and you want to go and adjust these, but you can't because you've already baked in some automation controlling this, controlling the channel faders. So it's usually a good habit to get into automating gain on the channel via a utility plugin than it is to automate the volume fader. It's sort of like a quality of life improvement. It just makes everything a lot easier to work with. And also, if using classic breaks, or if you've got any sort of like splicey wide sounds, you know, those magic splice sounds that sound amazing, but then you flatten them to mono and they sound like shit or they just disappear. Mono switch, super important. Let's move on to the next section. I have a couple of effects channels set up just for dragging and dropping, like your white noises, your reversed hi-hats, your reverse crashes, your impacts, whatever. Foley as well will go into here, like some vinyl crackles or some ambient sounds, parks. One of my personal favorites is to use bird samples, bird songs. They're really nice, add a nice sort of like character and texture to the sound, a lot of realism. It's great for atmosphere building. You got some EQ. Maybe if I'm using an impact, I'll put a compressor on there. If I've got a really wide sound, like an impact or a tension, like a riser or something that doesn't work well in mono, I've got a gain utility here, which I can, phase invert if need be, just to get that mono compatibility, and then add a bit of a width after that with stereo wideners. Usually I would create a send for these, like, a reverb or a delay, something like that, which would then have a sequencer channel made for them like this, so I can automate them. So just for argument's sake, I'll show you what that looks like. So create a new bus here. That's showing up as aux number 5. I'm going to right click on that, create new track, and now that will show up in the sequencer window. So it's just call that FX verb. Now, I used to have a project which went really in depth with buses and sends and aux and whatever, but I found that by doing so, it lost a lot of sort of creative freedom, because when you have too many things already there, you're less likely to try something new, like a new way of processing something, or just trying it. Instead of drawing for a reverb, you might draw for some sort of like granular delay with a really high grain amount. Just something a little more creative than just smacking Valhalla Room on everything. I don't want to get too much into that discussion now, because that's not really what the point of this video is, but yeah, that's the idea of the effects channels. Moving on to the samples. If you're working with samples, you just drag and drop here. Again, a gain utility just for some simple gain staging if need be. Channel EQ to clean up the samples, and then again another gain with the thoughts in mind of making sure it's mono compatible, basically. Probably a compressor will go on there, not necessarily using the compression function, but using the soft clipper that's built into it. After that, we go on to my vocal group. Again, gain staging. We've got another utility, a gain utility plugin, first thing on the channel. EQ, obvious reasons, EQ the sound. Now for vocals, I love the sound of an LA2A. It just sounds really good to me. You can double that up if you wanted with something like an 1176 to sort of like catch any pops and any wild transients just sticking through. Double compressing vocals is always a really good idea. So for example, you might want to use Logic's Studio FET, the 1176, just to catch those transients. And then after that, you might want to go into an LA2A just to get that really smooth, kind of buttery, slow acting compression, just to tighten it up and keep it controlled. Then after all that, usually with vocals, I would use this primarily as a mono switch. Obviously, you can automate the gain on that as well, so you retain fader control like I mentioned earlier. All right, moving on, because these are just duplicates, by the way. It's all the same channel, just duplicated. Right, so after the vocals, we have some soft synths. So keys, I recently picked up Addictive Keys. Quick tip, if you use any of the Focusrite interfaces, you get this for free, and you get to choose one of 4 sounds, I believe, 4 sound libraries for free, because you purchased a Focusrite sound card, which is really cool. I don't have a Focusrite sound card anymore. I used to have a 2i2, one which I bought initially when I first started producing again back in 2019, but I replaced that a few months ago with an SSL2, and you're currently listening to the SSL 4000, or there's a button that says 4K on the unit microphone preamp. It sounds pretty nice to me. It should sound massively better than my other videos where I was using a 2i2. That's not necessarily because the unit's bad, but this is just a level above that, so that's cool. But that's enough about Addictive Keys and the Keys channel, just to get some ideas down. I'm not the best piano player in the world. In fact, I'm awful, which is why I rely on something like Scalar. Scalar 2 is really useful, but that's a whole other video in itself. Alternatives for this would be Spitfire Audio Labs, their soft piano, and Spitfire Audio's felt piano is really cool too. I like that. There's another one which is a little more sort of like ambient and experimental by a company called Felt Instruments. There's a free one called the Walno. That sounds really cool. They've got a lot of texture to them. Let's move on to the synth now. My go-to synth for almost every part of synthesis that isn't organic sounds would be Serum. I'm not the best sound designer in the world. As far as a channel strip goes, completely depends on the sound. Like I've said a couple of times now, I don't like having too many things already baked in, because it all really depends on what's happening. I mean, if I'm using a pluck, I might go for a different compressor, so I don't want to have one already loaded up. Of course, with all of these, I would create sends to reverb channels respectively. So if I was to just give you a quick example here, for the sample stack, I would probably go sample verb, something like that. But yeah, like this principle just kind of carries on for anything. You could have another one for delay if you wanted to do that. Reiterating some things I've already mentioned, you would be wanting to have a reverb and then an EQ just to clean up that low end so it doesn't get too muddy. And another quick tip as well, if you've made it this far into the video, if you want your reverbs to have a little more presence in the mix, you could slap a distortion on it, obviously before the EQ, so you can rely on that EQ to clean up any nasties. If you want your reverb to be sort of like a little more upfront with a little more character, a little more definition, you can distort it. Almost last but not least, we've got another instance of Serum for my bass and my mid-bass sounds. It's just the initialized preset, and again, with the keys and the synth, the same thought process applies, in that I don't want to have too many things already at my disposal, because I get locked into using those, and you're not always exploring the best method at that point. You're just kind of like rinsing and repeating, which doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing, but it's not always the best tool for the job. And I mean, when I've had things baked into templates before, I end up changing them anyway, so I figured just strip it all back, increase that load time, just to get into the door quicker. So that'll be sort of like a mid bass. I might even go ahead, just like in Love Drops, I love an upright bass, and for that I would use the upright bass in Contact. That's really good, it sounds amazing. But I can go on a deeper dive into this actually. I'm not quite sure why I'm pulling this up now, but I can go on a deeper dive in a separate video if you wanted to see that. And then sub bass, which would sit underneath the mid bass, obviously, and I would EQ that accordingly. Again, it's Serum sub oscillator. It's really cool, really good. Either use a simple sine or a triangle. More harmonic content with the triangle, although sine waves work really well, and it all really depends on what's happening in that mid-range. You can sometimes get away with a triangle in a really busy mix. Other times you end up causing dissonance if there's too much harmonic content along with a really low playing piano, for example. If you've got a low octave piano that's sort of like sitting around the 200 hertz, sometimes dipping even down into the 160 hertz, if you're not cutting that out to make room for a harmonically rich sub, you're going to get dissonance, and it's going to sound awful and phasey and wobbly. So it's a really sort of case-by-case basis. Typically, simple sine wave, perfectly fine. Maybe a little bit of distortion on it. Tube, soft clip, anything like that, even the tape saturation here. But yeah, and then onto the master bus. So I have a channel set up here, because if I'm working with a drum group, the drum parallel or the room reverb, I can't have access to the stereo out channel without clicking on something else, so I like to have this in the sequencer. But this is pretty much my DIY faux mastering chain, if you want. So that consists of a basic channel EQ, a multi-band compressor, a clipper, and then 2 limiters, because I don't like hitting a single limiter too hard. I like to sort of like distribute the load, so that maybe 70 to 80% ozone would be doing sort of like the heavy lifting, and then Pro L just to push maybe an extra couple of dB if needed. Again, it's all sort of like case by case, dependent on the tune, on the track, on the content, whatever. And then after that, we've got a gain plugin, which I have set as a mono toggle. So if I wanted to check mono compatibility, I can just click that, and there you go, it's folded down to mono. And then after that, I've got another EQ. Now this is to identify problem areas. So usually I would use this to listen to the low end specifically. So I might cut all of that top end off, give down here a listen to make sure that's sounding right. And if it doesn't, I can go back and reference the full mix and then selective parts and then fix the issues in that area. Now after that, we've got some metering plugins. MSED by Voxengo is really good. Having a look at the stereo information, even though Span does that, I do enjoy using this a lot. Logic's multimeter, which I should really just switch out now for something like the level meter or loudness meter, mainly because I rely on Span for the spectral analysis now, but I like Logic's metering. I'm used to using Logic's metering, like this little part over here. And then Span, always good to keep a reference of how your mix is looking, especially when it comes to referencing tracks. That's pretty much my entire project on an overview level. If there's anything that you would like to see on a deeper dive, let me know in the comments. Send me a message if you want to. Like I said, this project will be available for Patreon members as a download. If you want to join, the link will be in the description below. No pressure. If you want to support me, that's great, thank you. If not, I'll be doing the YouTube thing. But just for those little nuggets of extra stuff, from sample packs to pre-release stuff to watching these videos early, Patreon's for that. I've also got a Discord server. Just get involved, you know? Or if you just want to subscribe to me on YouTube, that's cool. I'll be trying to keep on top of these videos now. So anything that you would like to see, just give me a message. Just drop it in a comment. If you found this video helpful, give it a like. I don't want to get too much into the YouTube.
Smash that like button, bro.
I don't want to do that here. I want to try and keep it, you know, a little less 12-year-oldy. But yeah. So that was my drum and bass project template for Logic Pro 10. I've been Prspktv. Thanks for watching.